Okay, so we're going to get started. Welcome to this is your second YouTube lecture of the semester. Just a couple reminders for you before I start. One, you should definitely have the writing journal that corresponds with this week. I think we're on week 8 open. You're going to want to read the instructions in that first, kind of know a little bit of what I'm expecting. The main thing it says in the writing journal is that you're going to want your book, your articulations book with you before you watch this recording. I'm going to reference things from chapter 10, Synthesizing and Incorporating Ideas, which is the title of this PowerPoint. But it's not required reading. I'm not making you read the whole chapter. I'm just going to reference a couple points in the chapter that I'm going to have you pause and read parts of that chapter as part of this lesson. So today we're talking about synthesizing and incorporating ideas, basically how to take a source. We've talked about, how to make sure you have the right source, how to evaluate it, all that stuff. Now we're going to talk about how to take that source and put it into your actual writing, incorporate those ideas into your writing. Now, the first thing you want to understand is the idea of thesis versus synthesis. Now, these words aren't actually related. I'm only clarifying the difference between the two. They're somewhat related. It's not like they're opposites or anything like that. I'm clarifying the difference between the two because I'm going to be using both these words a lot and they seem similar. So a thesis is just your proposition, your argument, or your point of view. You understand what this is. It's the main point you're making in your paper. Now, when you synthesize, what you do is you take a lot of different propositions or arguments or viewpoints and you combine them or you use them to support your thesis. Okay? So it says in the book on page 153, one hallmark of a strong writer is the ability to synthesize ideas from multiple sources to form his or her own opinions. That should say synthesize. One of the things I'm going to ask you to do in your writing is when you incorporate your sources, you need to do more than just have a quote in your paper. You need to show me how the ideas of that other writer inform your own opinion or help form your opinion or support your opinion or oppose your opinion. It needs to be really clear how the source relates. This is what synthesis is. Now, sometimes you'll see authors summarize multiple sources. This is something you can do in your writing. So rather than summarizing the main point of a source, you want to talk about the part of the source that relates to your ideas, especially in the context of other sources or your own ideas. So remember, we've talked about this. You'll see this in the reading you were supposed to do for today. You're creating a conversation, which means that you need to, rather than just saying, here's a source I found, here's the main point they're making, you need to talk about the ideas that they have in their writing or their source and how it fits into the context of your ideas. So here I'm going to ask you to pause for a second and open your book. Not yet. On page 154 of your book, it's that very last paragraph that starts with those who study human nature frequently. And then just the next two paragraphs, it goes up onto page 155. This is a prime example of someone synthesizing and then summarizing multiple sources in a single paragraph. I want you to take some time. You don't need to respond to this question in your writing journal or anything like that. I just want you to take some time to read over those paragraphs and notice how this author uses multiple sources in a single paragraph and how that's effective. I think sometimes students feel inclined to want to just do one source, one paragraph, one source, one paragraph, when it can be really useful to include multiple ideas and multiple sources to kind of situate your own ideas and to really bring a point home. Okay, so once you have paused here, taking a second to look over those paragraphs, ask yourself these questions. We're going to talk about synthesizing ideas to form your own argument. So if you look on page 163 And again, you can pause here and go read that over for you. I'm just pointing out kind of the highlights of this chapter. There's 5 ways that an idea can affect a reader or a listener. So 5 ways that they can respond to a source that you use. One is they can absolutely and just uncritically agree with it, right? Now, this is also true when you are trying to synthesize and understand a source yourself. The first possible way you can respond is just yes, absolutely, I agree with everything you said. It all sounds good. Now, 2, they can absolutely and uncritically disagree. Same thing. I don't agree with anything you said. I think everything you said is wrong. 3, they can use a source to become informed about an issue. This is a kind of source you can use in your own paper. I didn't necessarily find a main point from this source. This wasn't a rhetorical source or an arguable source, but it just taught me about this issue and I was informed. Sometimes we use sources in our papers just to give our readers some information, okay? And we want it to come from a more credible source than ourselves. 4, a source can convince them that an issue is important. So rather than saying you should agree or disagree with my issue, the argument of the source is this is something you should care about, or it is important, or there's a reason you should listen to me. The last one is probably the most common, and it's the way we most often respond to sources, which is I agree with some of the points you're making, not all of them. If this is true for your reader, you need to consider how you can discuss a source like this in your paper. They might agree with parts of what you're saying, and maybe you choose to only cite parts of a source that your reader would agree with, or you choose to cite parts they agree and disagree with and use it to discuss why you agree or disagree with parts of a source. Now, on page 167, it talks about, we start our discussion of how to use a source specifically in a paper. Do you want to quote it? Do you want to summarize it? Do you want to paraphrase it? All 3 of these are options. Now, quoting is the best choice. And by quoting, I mean using the author's direct words and language. Quoting is the best choice when the original wording is so eloquent, you like the way they wrote something, or it's focused, that if you were to change the quote and not use the author's direct words, something would be lost. You need those words the way they're written. Now, this eventually leads to a student asking, okay, so how long should my quote be? Generally, you want to pull enough direct words from your source that you can maintain control of the verb tense and sentence structure. So what this means is you want to use enough of the quote that you're not, like, it's not confusing why, like, if you just pull 3 words from a quote, it's going to be really confusing, like, how that even fits into your sentence. You want to control, like, keep enough of it that the sentence makes sense. You can change, like, verb tense or sentence structure to fit if you're, like, starting the sentence in your own words and then moving into a quote. And you can look up, like, the rules for this, but you can use ellipses or brackets to indicate, like, I'm making some slight changes here so that it makes sense within my sentence. One last comment I want to make on quoting here. I generally encourage avoiding block quotes. I think block quotes are rarely necessary, and I actually might talk about this later in the PowerPoint. But generally, block quotes come across as I wanted to fill space. It's really hard for me to see a justification in, like, all the words you're using there. But the general rule of block quotes when you're directly quoting is any quote you're using that is longer than 3 lines needs to be blocked. But again, I would avoid block quotes unless you seriously just feel like you need all the content of that quote in order for it to be helpful and useful to your reader. Okay, so your next option, if you're not directly quoting, is either to paraphrase or summarize from a text. Sometimes students don't realize this is an option. They feel like they have to be directly quoting, but there's a lot of benefits to paraphrasing or summarizing. So when you're paraphrasing, you're using your own words, your own sentence structure, but you're just, like, kind of retelling the source's main points and details, but in your own words. So it's usually the same length as the original. That's the difference between summarizing and paraphrasing. You would summarize a book as a whole, but you might paraphrase a sentence, right? But you're just putting it in your own words. Now, when and why you would want to paraphrase, the benefits of paraphrasing would be that you just don't lose your own voice or your own flow. And so when you put something in your own words and you keep it in your own words, even though you're bringing someone else's idea in and you're still giving credit, you're still doing an in-text citation when you paraphrase, what it does is it just keeps the flow of your own voice, which can be a big benefit for your reader. Your reading won't feel as choppy. There is such thing as like they call a half-baked paraphrase or plagiarism. Generally, the rule of thumb for you to not be plagiarizing is you can't copy 3 or more words directly from someone without putting it in quotation marks. So if you take 2 direct words in a row, you don't have to put it in quotation marks, but if you take 3 or more direct words from a quote, you need to put it in quotation marks or it's plagiarism. It's not paraphrasing. Now, summarizing is if you want to highlight only the most important details of like a larger passage. Okay, you're not going to paraphrase word for word 4 paragraphs, so you're going to summarize them. Even if you are summarizing like a whole article and you're not even directly taking from one specific part of it, you always want to cite the source. Even if the wording is completely your own, if you get the idea from someone else, include a citation. Now, tips for interacting with a source. What this means, this is a fancy way of saying tips for actually just putting the quote or this paraphrase or the summary in your paper. The first is to use the quote sandwich. What this means is anytime you are going to use someone else's idea, the first thing you have to do is introduce it. So you need to use the proper name of the title of the article, the author, where it was from, whatever information you feel like your reader needs to kind of understand the credibility of the source. Somehow you want to introduce it. You want to say, so-and-so from the University of blank said this, or so-and-so found on blank network, or here's their credentials, whatever it is, introduce it. You never want to just start quoting or start paraphrasing or start summarizing if possible, because that can be really jarring and confusing for a reader while you're all of a sudden quoting someone else or talking about someone else's ideas. You want to introduce it in some way. Indicate that you are moving into someone else's ideas. Now, the next thing you want to do is actually just directly quote it, or if you're going to paraphrase or summarize. Now, generally, like I was saying, 3 lines or less, no block quotes, please, unless it's super, super justified. The last thing you want to do is you want to respond to the quote with your own thoughts or opinions. Now, this is the most important part, and this is often the part that students forget. You set up the quote, you directly quote it, and then you just kind of move on. But that makes for an awkward conversation. You're making a conversation here. If someone says something, you need to respond. You need to speak back. So what this means is just say why you use that quote, why you agree with that quote, why you disagree with that quote, why it teaches your audience something important. Explain why that quote is there. Now, just a reminder, you can summarize a quote, you can paraphrase a quote, but you have to give credit with a correct in-text citation, which we're going to talk about in a second. Now, the last thing that we need to talk about for this section is what are reasons. This is a little bit of a review. We've touched on this before. Now I'm just going to pretend, this is my pretend thesis statement for a pretend paper so I can demonstrate this concept. So let's pretend that I am making the argument that Las Vegas should build more indoor community swimming pools. Okay, I think it's too hot here in the summer, it's colder here in the winter, we need more indoor community swimming pools. This is the paper I'm writing. Okay. Now, that's my thesis statement. That is my argument. Now, reasons are separate from a thesis statement. Reasons are why my thesis is correct or important, and these are the things that I want sources to support. So I don't want to have 5 sources that say my thesis over and over again. I want sources that support my reasons why my thesis is correct or important. So a reason why we should have more indoor community swimming pools. Well, one is it's really hot outside. Less people will get heat stroke, sunburn, sun-related problems if we had indoor swimming pools. Another reason is that residents can swim year-round. Now notice, in none of these am I repeating my thesis. These are reasons, and these are things that I can use sources to support. Another would be generate revenue for the city. They can put that money back into education here. It's important for you to understand that when you're including sources in your paper, that you're not just looking for sources that repeat your thesis. You're looking for sources that support your reasons. Now, as you are forming these paragraphs and as you are coming up with reasons, finding sources to support those reasons, and forming paragraphs, it's important that you understand how to transition between paragraphs. We'll touch on this more throughout the semester, but this is your first introduction to transition sentences. A good rule of thumb for a transition sentence. Now, a transition sentence is the beginning sentence of every paragraph, okay? This is your topic sentence, which is already doing a lot of work, and we're going to put a little more work onto that topic sentence and ask it to transition for us. Now, a good rule of thumb for that first sentence of a paragraph is that it references the previous idea's paragraph and it introduces the next. So if we're using my example thesis from the previous slide, I might say something like, so let's say my previous paragraph was talking about how residents would be less likely to get heat stroke. I'm starting a new paragraph now. I might say something in my transition like, well, it's great that Las Vegas residents would be less likely to get heat stroke at an indoor pool. Building these pools would be worth it just for the ability to swim year-round. So now my audience understands I don't awkwardly just start a whole new topic. I've acknowledged the previous paragraph's idea, and I've introduced the next, which is the ability to swim year-round. Now the expectation is that the rest of this paragraph will be about the ability to swim year-round. Again, if I'm doing this in another paragraph, I would say, while residents are swimming year-round, the city of Las Vegas can bring in more revenue to put back into the dying education system. Now the expectation is, now that's a pretty big jump from swimming year-round to the dying education system, but if I have a transition sentence like this, it makes that not awkward at all. It's really clear to my reader why I'm jumping from this topic to the next. Other good rules of transition sentences. Don't repeat the same structure for every transition sentence. You notice here, those are two really similar sentences. You should not repeat that twice. If you're going to use the while intro and this kind of transition at the beginning of one paragraph, don't repeat that. Find other ways to transition without just having that same structure. 2, sometimes it is okay to just use a transition word. You don't have to do this with every paragraph. If it's pretty obvious to your reader why you're moving from one idea to the next, you can get away with just saying, however, or therefore, or whatever, just like a simple word. Now, this is the main one. Before following any rule that I give you, remember that audience is what matters most. So really, when you're transitioning from one idea to the next, it's not so important whatever rule I've given you. It's what sounds nice, what would make sense to them, what would be most persuasive. That's the choice you should make. Now, that kind of ends the instructional writing part of this PowerPoint. These are all just tips for editing, incorporating your sources, finishing up all that writing. You should basically have the instruction you need now to power through with finishing up a draft and starting in on editing. The last thing we're going to talk about today is in-text citations and works cited pages. Now, the tricky thing about teaching this is that I can't just say, all right, guys, here's all the rules you need to know. Now you know the rules, do it. Because there are just thousands of rules and specific situations, and MLA can get complicated when you're using different kinds of sources and if you go into the Purdue OWL website and just look at how many tabs there are for MLA, you realize why I can't fit that all into a PowerPoint. So instead, what I can do is I can give you the basics and then point you to some sources, which is what I'm going to do. So first of all, basic rules for in-text citations. 1, the source information required in a parenthetical citation depends, 1, upon the source medium, so what kind of source you're using, and the source's entry in a works cited page. So when we're talking in-text citation, this is when you put some information in parentheses after a quote or after you've summarized or paraphrased a source. And the goal of that in-text citation is that it leads your reader to the correct entry on the works cited page so that they can then follow that to your actual source. So the only goal of an in-text citation is to make sure that they get the information they need to find the right entry on the works cited page. Now, any source information that you provide in text has to correspond to the source information on the works cited page. The two have to match. The in-text citation is a clue for which entry on your works cited page you're referencing or you're pulling from. So more specifically, whatever signal word or phrase you provide to your readers in the text has to be the first thing that appears on the left-hand margin of the corresponding entry on the works cited page. Now let me give you some examples of this so that it makes a little more sense. If this is an entry on my works cited page, Executive on a Mission, Saving the Planet, it was written by Cornelia Dean. Now, Dean is that first thing that appears in the left-hand margin of this entry, which means that that word, Dean, needs to be in my in-text citation. So an in-text citation would look like this. I'd have my direct quote. I would put my parentheses because I'm directly quoting, or I would put my quotation mark. I would hit the space bar, and then in parentheses, I would put just the last name of the author and then a period. The reason you put your period after is it helps the reader understand that that in-text citation belongs with the quote that's in that sentence. This all needs to be structured exactly like this. Quotation marks, space, parentheses, the last name, parentheses, the period. Now notice there is no page number. If there was a page number, I would also include that in the parentheses. I think I have an example of that further down, but you don't put page, you don't put PG, you don't put a number sign, anything like that. You just put the last name, space, a number of the page, and otherwise it would look exactly like this. Here's another example. If this is my source, An Inconvenient Truth, now notice this was directed by David Guggenheim, but there's no like author. This is a movie, right? So it's not directed, it's not written by a specific person. So my in-text citation isn't going to have a last name in it because there is no author. It's instead going to have, now this can be a little tricky. Whatever is, they say like if it's a small phrase in the title that you can pull, great. Or if it's a short title, put the whole thing. This is a short title. So again, I would do it the same. I'd put the direct quote, quotation marks, space, and then in the parentheses, I would put the full title since it's a short title. If it was a longer title, if it was a 10-word title, I'd try and just put like the first 3 words or something like that. Parentheses and period. Okay, last example. I chose this one because it has page numbers in it. So this is a journal article written by William D. Nordhaus. It's found on page 31 and 34 of whatever journal. My in-text citation would look something like this. Now notice since I summarized the text, I don't have quotation marks. If it's not a direct quote, you don't put quotation marks, but otherwise it looks the same. I have a space, and in my parentheses, I have the last name of the author, space, the page number, parentheses, period. Again, these are just 3 common examples. You're most likely not going to have a lot of page numbers because you're looking at web sources, unless you're using academic sources, which often do have page numbers. If it's a web source, sometimes you won't even have an author or an electronic source. So really, you're trying to, you're going to have to look these up on a case-by-case basis, and we'll talk about where you can in a second. Now, the actual works cited page. This is tricky for me to give you all the rules on it, so I'm just going to tell you some resources. Purdue OWL Online is the most reliable source. If you look up Purdue OWL MLA formatting, their website is considered like the authority on MLA. You will find correct answers there. Now, there are such things as citation generators. You want to be careful with these because they don't always perfectly create citations for you. but like EasyBib or Citation Machine, or you can just search citation generators. Sometimes they have fees, but there's free ones out there that can help you create citations. You can also go to the Writing Center. They have a lot of good worksheets, and they also will sit down with you and just go over your works cited page and your sources and your formatting. Now, here's how a works cited page should look. Few things that you want to note. We still have our last name and page number in the top right-hand corner. The title is centered, it's not bolded, it's not underlined, and it just says works cited. Now, the actual citations, you'll notice, are in alphabetical order. That is exactly how it's supposed to be. And they are indented so that the first line extends the whole way and everything else is indented. I think it's just one tab. It might be half an inch for the rest of the citation. Now, beyond this, you are responsible for looking this up and making sure that you're getting this right. There's lots of like pre-made templates out there. There's lots of guides. Your book has information on how to format these things. Use your resources. Figure out how to do this correctly. The thing I always tell my students about works cited pages and in-text citations is that they're easy points, and so you don't want to miss them, but usually the way students miss these points is they wait until the very end and they run out of time to get this right. So if you're organized and you keep your works cited page up as you go, your in-text citations will be easier, your citations will be easier, and this will all be ready for you. The last thing I do need to know is that a works cited page doesn't count as one of your required 3 to 5 pages. You still need 3 pages of text and a works cited page on top of that. Sometimes I get that question. It might have just been obvious to you already. That is everything. As always, you can email me if you have any questions, and I hope that you guys are having a good day, and I will figure out how to stop this.